All right, hello and welcome. I hope that intro wasn't too unnerving. But what it gets at is something that I have been hearing a lot that I've wanted to make a video about for a while. And I've been trying to, I don't know if this will be the only video I make or what, but I've got some thoughts about it that I think specifically about the idea, the notion that, quote, everything is political, right? And this has been kind of especially brought to the front because of the recent situation with the game engine Godot, right? We've got this new Rito fork that's supposedly trying to be apolitical. And people always ask the question, isn't leaving something because it's too political itself a political act? And I think this is making a mistake that in the sense that it is denying a difference between something is political, but we don't something is political, but we don't choose to have an effect on it at this time, and something should be kept away from politics entirely. And it's also making the mistake of assuming that like things that have secondary add-on effects are by their own nature primarily political. Wicker versus Filburn is a good example of this. It basically said that everything is interstate commerce, and therefore everything can be regulated. There are a lot of negative aspects of this that we're going to get to. But to start, I want to think about this from a logical perspective. And I think that everything is political is, perhaps ironically, one of those, well, not ironically, but perhaps humorously, one of those arguments that prove too much. Because if everything is political, then logically the word political is useless. It means the same thing as a word that we already have, everything. From the purely logical perspective, it makes no sense to use a word political if everything is political. The use of the word political instead of the word everything is already an admission that not everything is political. It's worth noting that what something being political means is that there is someone somewhere that can tell you what to do in regards to this particular thing. That there's no limitation in this particular area as to what you can be forced to do regarding some particular thing. It is, in fact, the credo of totalitarians. That's why I started with that Mussolini quote, because people like Mussolini and Stalin indeed believe that everything is political, and that's the problem. The problem is that a lot of really bad people use the credo that everything is political to put everything within the scope of their power. And, if we believe, that government should be limited in some sense at all, then indeed there must be some things that are not political. And that's something that we need to hold on to. I mean, especially from my perspective, I want everything to be non-political. There shouldn't be anybody who can force you against your will and against the agreements that you've previously made, or without an agreement that you've previously made, to do things that you don't want to do that don't involve aggression against somebody else. Do or not do things that you want to do that don't involve aggression against somebody else, right? That's kind of the whole point. And like, the other thing about everything being political is that you end up with this negative incentive cascade of sorts, where horrible atrocities are committed with the justification that it's just political. The Mao's Great Leap Forward was just politics, man. We can't really get mad at the fact that tens of millions of people were killed. The Holodomor, that's just politics, man. I mean, we can oppose it now, but the people who were there, that was what their politics said they should do. It gives people a reason or a rationale to justify violence against people who don't have any formal connection to any aggression or to any system that is based on aggression, right? If I contract with you to provide you with a bushel of wheat every month in return for $10, I don't know what the numbers are these days, but whatever, right? If I make that contract with you, that's not political. It is a contract. You don't have any power over me to enforce anything other than the terms of the contract, and I don't have any power over you to enforce terms other than the terms of that contract, right? In the same way that I can't say, oh, I want $12 this month, you can't say, oh, I want 2 bushels this month. And these are things that could be handled by a non-political arbitration system, right? A judge within the agreement, we could both agree that we'll go to this judge if there's a dispute about the contract, but the contract itself is so simple that we wouldn't really expect to be able to cheat it in any significant way. It'd be pretty obvious that either someone has not paid their $10 or someone has not provided their bushel of wheat, and this is a fairly simple problem to deal with. On the other hand, once you admit that everything is political, then that simple contract between you and me becomes not just the prerogative of the two of us to make a deal with each other. It becomes the business of the entirety of humanity, and that is again something that we don't want to happen to everything for sure, unless you are in fact a totalitarian. And I think that I'm pretty safe in my assertion that, generally speaking, totalitarians are not good people. But it goes further than this, because even if we admit that there's this issue with everything is political taken relatively literally, there's also this softer version where you have this notion that everything affects politics, and therefore politics affects everything. And this is kind of a misread. It's similar to Wickard versus Filburn, right? In Wickard versus Filburn, which I believe was in the 1930s or the 1940s, it was a late 1930s to early 1940s. It was a Supreme Court decision. The Constitution, the so-called agreement that binds America together, right, says that Congress shall have the ability to regulate interstate commerce. If we ignore the problems with scope creep of the word regulate to begin with, let's just ignore that issue altogether, right? What Wickard versus Filburn said is that a man who grew grain to feed his own animals was committing interstate commerce by that act because his act of self-reliance affected interstate commerce. And what that does, and I maintain that this is a misread of the intention of those statements in the Constitution, right? That it was never intended for something that someone makes themselves to serve their own purposes be counted as a part of interstate commerce. The reason that this was done was to give the government more power, a greater scope of power to regulate, to force people to produce or not produce things for themselves, which they otherwise would be able to do so without interference by any popular vote, right? The problem with this everything affects politics perspective is really that it leads to the same place as totalitarianism, just with softer words to get there, right? Once you admit that the government can regulate what I produce, if I write on a piece of paper something to remind myself to do something, then that's affecting interstate commerce, and therefore, by the Wickard v. Filburn opinion, it can be regulated. The government can regulate what I write on a piece of paper in my own home only for my own eyes, right? This gives the government infinite power to do whatever it wants because we have, given up the ghost in the sense that we've said, oh yeah, everything is affected by politics, and that means that everything is political. It basically gives the worst people in society, politicians, more power over people, and we need to prevent that at basically all costs. It's worth noting that there's a difference, that there's not just a duality here. There's actually 3 things that are happening here that from a non-anarchist perspective we need to look at as separate entities, as separate arguments, right? Number 1, I exercise power, political power, over X. Perfect example is the income tax. The government says that it can basically do whatever it wants with the income tax. It can tailor the income tax to make it into something like a fine, but not a fine, to adjust your behavior in an infinite number of different ways. There's no limit to what the government can do with the income tax. Number 2, I do not exercise power over X, but I could. Now this is the totalitarian perspective of a limited totalitarianism. If that seems like a contradiction in terms, but bear with me for a second. Imagine that the government also says that because I can do whatever I want with the income tax, therefore anything that I allow you to keep of your income is like a gift from me. And therefore, I could set income tax rates to 100%, and I could also demand you to keep working as hard as you are now for the income at the tax rate that you have now. But I don't. And there's multiple problems with this. Number 1, it is a totalitarian statement. Number 2, it also expands government power because it basically says, hey, you worked this hard at a 35% income tax rate. You must also work this hard at a 50% or 60% or 80% or 100% income tax rate. And there's nothing you can say to prevent that because it's just political. I didn't exercise this power. Now I do. I do not exercise this power, but I could. This is the second category, which kind of mashes in with the first category, right? The government choosing not to do things but also reserving the power to do so is a different category from the government saying, I do not have the power to do that, which, is a freakishly small number of things these days, unfortunately. But that's our third category. The government saying, I shall not exercise power over X under any circumstances. And, I would argue that we're fairly close to that category with, say, speech. Speech that doesn't include profanity or obscenity, right? Political speech. And of course, these three things are separated, but you can draw a little bit of gray area between them in general, right? Like the government says it may not exercise power over your inoffensive speech, right? But it also admits that there's a line where something may be offensive, and then then that goes into the category of things that they do not exercise power over, but could, right? Like if I say a curse word here, the government says that it could regulate my use of that curse word because that would be obscenity, right? But it doesn't. But if I say, John Locke was a great philosopher, at least in theory, the government admits no power over such an anodyne, basic political basic statement of philosophy as that. And saying that you're in favor of Locke is, a political statement, I guess. But saying, saying I'm in favor of boxer shorts is an even more anodyne version of that. And this is the kind of thing that actually works its way insidiously into stuff like public goods theory, right? And this has all been broken down by Hans Hermann Hoppe, right? Like, I can claim that you have done a damage to me by not wearing deodorant, right? But realistically, this is not something that is seen as part of the political sphere in general. Certainly, it could be part of the political sphere. That would be a usurpation of more power by the state to control more people, but down that road, again, leads to totalitarianism. And so, yeah, that kind of sums up, kind of as a top-level look, because I'm trying to do shorter videos that maybe aren't quite as in-depth, but also do cover something. But anyway, there's a difference between I do have power over this, I do have power over this, but I choose not to exercise it, and I do not have power over this. And if we don't live in a world where there are certain things that the government does not have the ability to exercise power over, then we already live in a totalitarian system. It's just that the totalitarians are being a little bit nice to us. And I would argue that any such totalitarian system is, by definition, illegitimate. It is slavery. And therefore, it is not something that people need to pay attention to or, obey. And it is also something that people can resist and try to exit, right? From a philosophical perspective, if the argument is you are a slave, then you have the right to defend yourself against your slave master. He is committing aggression against you. So, yeah, everything is political is a really bad thing for logical reasons, because it makes the word political meaningless, and also because it leads to a lot of massively negative incentives. And the more things that the further you spread the net of, well, this affects politics, therefore it's political, the more power you give to the worst among us, politicians. So that's my short spiel about this for today. I'm working on this stuff because this has been a really weird few weeks, right? We have people making like blanket denials of political violence, which again is one of those arguments that proves too much, right? I disavow political violence means that you disavow the American Revolution. It means that you disavow, the resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto. It's really bad to do that. And yet people are doing it. People make these irresponsible arguments all the time, and that's something that really bugs me a lot. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit here and there. I'm hopeful that you'll find that interesting and maybe even a little bit funny or even enlightening, goodness gracious. But yeah, it's a bad position to have because it proves too much, because it creates extremely destructive incentives, and because it denies the possibility that there's something that someone could not be justified at pointing a gun at your head to make you do or not do. So yeah, not everything is political, and we should be damn happy that that's the case, and we should be damn intent on keeping it that way as well. That's all I've got for today. Yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you want to support the channel, you know what to do. And yeah, see you next time. Have a good one.